Hello, everybody. Hi. You're all muted. There's this like an interesting moment at the beginning of these Zoom sessions where I'm like, oh, hi, everyone, but I'm the only one talking. I can hear everyone, so nice to see everybody. We're just gathering together, and we're going to take just a couple more minutes to let people get on the call. Nice to see you all. Nice to see some of you. Nice to see the names of other people. Yeah. Hey, my friends. It's like nice to portal into people's houses who I haven't seen now for weeks. All right, so just enjoy yourselves for another couple of minutes, and we'll get started.
Hi, Caroline. I'm going to see you in the morning.
I know, I can't wait.
That must be your husband or some terribly
Hello, it's nice to meet you, Jane.
man.
I've heard a lot about you.
Uh-oh.
I understand you taught a wagon wheel way back when.
I did.
I am a proud alum.
You know, it was so funky back when I taught there. We were literally like stealing children off the street. Maybe we stole you off the street.
I think we did the timeline. I think I started maybe the year after you left or something like that. So I think we just missed each other. But
well, now I'm totally depressed.
We're totally hijacking this session.
That's so cool. That's great.
It's Mariana is there. Oh my gosh, so nice to see you. Okay, as I sort of like warm up here, first thing I'm going to do is share with you the material that we're going to be looking at, and it'll appear in the chat box. It's a Google Doc, and everybody should have access to it, so let me know if there's any problem getting that. As I've already gotten used to doing, I'm going to be screen sharing back to that document, so when we're really in the text, if you want, you don't even have to access it separately, but you can, and some people like to have it and some people like to print it out, so there it is, but I'll screen share and we'll go kind of back into it. All right, we are gathering here. Okay, I think we can get started. Okay, welcome everybody. I'm very excited to begin, well, I guess maybe that's the wrong word. We are happy to be able to do some preparation for this very bizarre Passover that we're about to enter into. I don't know if excitement is the word, but certainly curiosity. Like, what is this going to be like? And, you know, we're shul. We're here to, you know, help with all of your Jewish needs. But this year it feels like Passover in particular, a lot of us are going to be on our own, and we're going to need tools and resources to figure out how are we going to do this. So that's the point of this session and a session that we're holding also on Sunday. And the Sunday session is actually going to be a 2-hour session. This is going to be basically a 1 hour and 15-minute max session, but 1 hour is what we're looking at. And that's because on Sunday, we're going to really kind of go through the entire Seder. The Sunday session is called How to Lead Your Own Seder, and we're going to go through the entire Seder. And let me just begin by giving you a kind of just a look at what the Seder itself looks like, which is the word Seder we use to refer to the Passover meal, but the Seder, the word Seder in Hebrew means order, and it refers to the order of a series of things that we do throughout the Passover meal. And you can see the 14, 15 things, whether you combine number 7 or not here. 14, 15 things we do during the Seder. And we'll explain all of those things on Sunday, but tonight's session is gonna be a kind of a deep dive into this number 5 here, which has the bigger font. Really the most important section of the Seder, and really the purpose of the whole Seder, which is the Magid section of the Seder. The part of the Seder that where everything stops and we start telling the story. And either we tell the story or we read from the Haggadah, and we take turns reading from the Haggadah. We'll talk a little bit about exactly why we might do one or another kind of Magid, but that's the point of tonight, is to get into what does it mean to tell the story of Egypt, not just on a a personal and spiritual and psychological level, although yes, those things too, but really like what are we supposed to do? That's the whole point of the Passover Seder, is to tell the story of Egypt. Magid, if you even listen to the word, sounds like Haggadah, right? Magid, Haggadah, and that's because that's what the Haggadah is. It's your instruction manual for telling the story of the Exodus from Egypt. But on some level, it's not a great instruction manual, because when you open it up, it looks like a mess. It doesn't make a lot of sense, and that's what we're going to try and make sense of it tonight. Okay, so let's just begin by asking, why do we tell the story of Egypt? Where did we get that idea that that's what we're supposed to do on Passover, is to tell the whole story? But we don't do that on every holiday. So where does that come from? Why do we have that? Anyone want to answer? When I ask generally I appreciate the muted and not hearing the background noise, but when I ask a direct question, I'll invite you to unmute yourselves and respond. And I'm not great at checking the chat for responses, so you can post things there to each other, but I won't be able to read them in real time, I'm finding. So anyone got an answer? Why do we tell the story of Egypt? Why is that so central to Passover?
We want to teach our children.
That's right. Great, Susan. We want to teach our children. That's exactly where we're headed. And on this call, actually, we have invited sort of tiers of participants. Some of you are going to stay with me the whole time. Some of you are going to break off at a certain point into a Zoom breakout room with Rabbi Tzadok, who's going to have sort of Seder tips for parents of elementary school age children. And we have another breakout room with Beth and Jane for parents of preschool age children. And that's because that's really our topic tonight, is telling this story to children. Susan's right, that's where the whole idea of telling the story comes from. But as we'll soon see, it's a little more complicated than that, though it's absolutely right that that's the core. It's like some sort of teaching your children. This is a children-centered mitzvah or commandment. Okay, so here's what we're going to do to figure this all out. Is we're going to turn to Maimonides, because Maimonides wrote this really amazing book, the Mishna Torah, in which what he attempted to do was summarize all of Judaism. So he tries to just give you the basics, like what do you have to do, what are the laws, to take the entire rambling discussion of the Talmud and turn it into a very precise code. So here is the section of the Rambam's Mishnah Torah here, Maimonides' Mishnah Torah, where he begins to discuss what we're looking at tonight, which is the telling of the story. And look at what he says, because he starts in a different place than I would expect him to, okay? So take a look at the opening here of the chapter in which he describes the telling of the story of Egypt. Here we are. It is a commandment, mitzvot say, it is a commandment in the Torah to tell the story of the miracles and wonders that were done for our ancestors in Egypt on the night of the 15th of Nisan. As it says, remember this day that you went out from Egypt. Just like it says, remember the Sabbath day. Okay. And even if one has no children, even the very wise are still obligated to tell the story of Egypt. And the more one extends the telling of the story, the more praiseworthy he is. Okay, so what is the commandment there, and where does it come from? Well, maybe I'm asking too much of a leading question, because the commandment is tell the story of Egypt, right? It was obvious. Where does it come from? Where do we get the idea that we're supposed to tell the story of Egypt?
Well, there is the commandment specifically to tell your children.
Okay, that's right. But Maimonides didn't just reference that commandment. This is what I want to point out here. If we look back in this opening section of his discussion of the story, he says, we tell the story because it says, remember this day you went out from Egypt, just like it says, remember the Sabbath day. That's not an unfamiliar formulation for the Torah. Zachor et Yom HaShabbat, remember the Sabbath day. So too, remember that you left Egypt. So, okay, so there's a parallel he's drawing. So when do we remember this? How do we remember the Sabbath day? When do we do that?
On Friday night before Kiddush, we tell the story of how we got to the end of the 6th day and then Shabbat.
Good, exactly right, exactly right. The Kiddush is thought of as the moment where a lot of our Sabbath activities are about not doing things, but the Kiddush, Joanna is exactly right, is the active, we are now making mention. In fact, the word in Hebrew for remember is similar to the word for mention. So it's like we're saying, we are remembering the Sabbath day through Kiddush, and so presumably we could do the same thing on Passover. We would say, I make a blessing over this wine, and it is Passover, and God took us out of Egypt, hooray, right? So just note that seems like a relatively straightforward, just like the Sabbath, maybe just like all the holidays. And he even went so far as to say, it doesn't matter whether you have children or not. It doesn't matter whether you get it. You're obligated to tell the story of Egypt. That is how he opens. But take a look at the next passage, or what we call the next halakha, the next law that he gives. And again, he uses the language of mitzvah. It's a commandment. And here we get to the place that we've already been anticipating. It is a commandment to inform your children, lo dia labanim, even if they don't ask, as Exodus 13:8 states, V'higareta levincha, you shall tell your child. A father should teach his child according to the child's knowledge. We can, in modern times, turn that to parent, but in the Hebrew it says aviv, father. So a father should teach a child according to the child's knowledge. Okay, so this is one of the nice things about Maimonides writing this book, is that one person sort of gave his whole take on Judaism. So when there are differences in language, we don't just say, oh, well, two different people wrote it two different ways. We can be very precise. And in this case, the precise question we can ask is, what's the difference, right? He mentions one commandment, which is that we should all tell the story. We all have to tell the story, just like we have to remember Sabbath. So we have to remember Egypt. But now there's a new mitzvah, another expression of commandment, and it is that you have to tell your children. So what's the difference there? Why are there two separate commandments that he mentions? Any thoughts?
It's like being passive versus more active. So on Shabbat, we're kind of just remembering, but not necessarily talking about it, whereas on Passover, we're really actively teaching our children.
Okay, good. Anyone want to add to that?
I was going to say, is there any correlation to the fact that in every service, there's something about Moses? It's in every single service. Is that like keeping the Shabbat? We mention Moses every week. I mean, it seems like it's a very, it's alluded to if it's not specific, but.
Okay, that's a lovely noticing there, Liana, because that's right. I think we can take Tzvi's comments and build on them, because Tzvi says it seems like the remembering, or just even asking us to tell the story, is something that we could get away with relatively quickly, relatively easily, without much depth. We are everybody's obligated to, on Passover, say, hey, it's Passover and God took us out of Egypt, hooray. But once you introduce, and in fact, to incorporate Liana's insight, it is actually the case that we remember the Exodus from Egypt all the time, right? When else do we remember the Exodus from Egypt? Anyone? Liana's right that we're talking about that story all the time. When else do you hear Zecher Letziat Mitzrayim? Does that sound familiar?
Kiddush.
That's right. Joanna's right again with the same answer. In the Shabbat Kiddush, and in many of our liturgical recitations, we remember the leaving of Egypt. So think of it this way: there's a general, just like Shabbat is an important thing, and it references our creation story, and it's always out there. We should always keep Shabbat in mind, though of course on Shabbat we make special mention of it. So too, there's a general idea, our whole religion is founded on this general idea that you should remember that God took us out of Egypt. That's a big deal. It's all over our prayers. It's all over our holidays. Even on other holidays we mention it. But once we incorporate this other mitzvah of telling the story to your children, then things get more complicated. As Tzvi said, then we have to start thinking, well, wait a minute, these are kids. So how are we gonna do this? I could say, oh yeah, I remembered the story of Egypt. I even told the story. It goes like this: God took us out of Egypt. Great, that's the end. But once we have the mitzvah of telling the story to your children, then we have to start to think about exactly how to do it. And we have it explicitly, as Maimonides pointed out, because we have the language in the first mitzvah of remember this day you went out from Egypt. But then we get to this really critical verse that he mentions in the second paragraph that says, you shall tell your child. The Torah is very explicit that it isn't just whatever memory, there's a very pointed commandment to tell your children. And in fact, the language in that commandment, I bolded it here so you can see, the language of that commandment, v'higadata levincha, you shall tell your child, is again that same language that we use to form the word Haggadah. So Haggadah literally means the telling, and it is based on this commandment that you tell your children. So that's where it all comes from, and that, though there are many, I mean, like the whole book of Exodus is Passover, there are many commandments associated with it and many relationships we can have to the Exodus story. The commandment to tell your children, or to tell children the story, becomes the real center of the Passover experience, and especially after the destruction of the temple, when we're no longer offering sacrifices, the commandment to tell the story and to tell the story to the children really becomes what Passover is, okay? So I started off by saying there's a Seder, but this is the most important part of the Seder. Well, this most important part of the Seder is really geared towards older people talking to younger people and conveying the message to them, okay? So then the question is, well, what if you don't have children? Is this no longer relevant? And we'll get there. But let's start thinking a little bit about how it's done. How do you perform this commandment of telling the story to children? So Maimonides gives a couple of really pedagogically interesting answers. Okay, and you will. Where's my? It's not working. Share screen. There it is. All right, let's take a look at the first one. How does this work? If the child is young or simple-minded, one should tell him, my child, in Egypt we were all slaves, like a maid or a butler. On this night, the Holy Blessed One redeemed us and took us out to freedom. If the child is older and wiser, I guess, or wiser, one should inform him, and the gender here is him, but one should inform him or her of everything that happened to us in Egypt and all the miracles done for us by Moses, our teacher. Everything one says is according to the child's knowledge. Lefi dato shel ben. Okay, what is, first of all, I'll throw two questions out there. What part of the Seder does that remind you of? And okay, let's start with that. What part of the Seder does that immediately remind you of? I see Susan mouthing it, which is the four children. Four sons, right?
4 children.
That's where we get this idea of telling the story in 4 different ways to 4 different children. But let's speak it now outside of the text. What's the principle here? And I think it's a really critical principle for beginning to understand how Passover is going to work for kids, but for us all. What's the principle? Feel free to unmute and contribute.
Different people have different needs and like.
Good, that's right. Hakol lefi dato. Everybody's got a different mind, a different consciousness, and different ways of learning. Liz, were you going to add to that at all?
It's always seemed to me that one of the big principles is that we were there, and to impart that sense of actually being there, whatever the age of the kids.
Good. So there's something, what you're adding is that there's a kind of, we usually think, and Ben just said, well, it depends on the person standing in front of you. That's how you tell the story. But Liz, you're suggesting it's like it's also relational. It depends on the parent as well. Like how do I tell this story to this kid? Not just how does this kid get the story told to, but what's this dynamic and how does this story flow between us? I like that. Anybody else want to add or speak this out? Susan, I see you.
Well, it's not just children. There are adults also who have different understandings, and the conversation should be appropriate to a variety of needs.
Okay, good. Exactly right. And that I think that's what's important here for all of us in all of our tiers, whether we have children at our seders or not. This in the language of educational theory is differentiated learning, right? Different kids have different learning styles, different needs, but it is also a way of saying, first of all, that as Susan's saying, well, everybody's got a different way of learning, and everybody's got a different way of telling the story. Everybody's got a different way of hearing the story, and there are going to be lots of different ways of telling the story. And I want to say that really emphatically, though it seems like it's for kids that we talk about this, or maybe it's an obvious point. Oh, we all learn in different ways. But for the purpose of Passover, it is important because it means there is no one way to perform the commandment of Magid. There's no one specific story or one set of texts that you have to read. There are many ways to tell the story of Egypt, and you try to figure out how to tell it given the people that are in front of you. So as you begin to think about your own seders, remember that, because I think the most common and mistake that we make in our performance of this mitzvah is just to read through the Haggadah. And some people like it, and that is their way, and it's nostalgic and it's great, but that is not the way that our tradition tells us that we're supposed to perform this commandment. We're supposed to try and figure out what is the best way to tell the story to the people that are in front of us. Okay, so let's keep that in mind, whether we have children in front of us or not. Okay, so that's one principle of storytelling that Maimonides is highlighting, the principle of differentiated learning, or shaping the learning to the audience or to the relationship, as Liz was suggesting. Here's another one, and this really does take us into the realm of children, but it also gives us a sense of exactly why so many things are the way they are on Passover. Okay, the Maimonides continues. One should make changes on this night, tzarich lasot shinui balayla zeh, so that the children will see and ask, why is this famous line, ma nishtana layla zeh? Why is this night different from all other nights? And then he replies to them, this and this happened, and this took place. Okay, now I'm going to soon ask you to speak out. What is the principle here? Again, what is Maimonides telling us about how to tell a story? But just for fun, let's see some of the changes that he suggests, because we make changes, but these aren't the ones that I'm familiar with. So what changes should be made? He should give them roasted seeds and nuts. The table should be snatched away, taken away before they eat. Just as they're about to eat, they take the table away. I don't know exactly how that works. And the matzot should be snatched from each other, and things like that. Okay, so so let's speak this out. What is he saying? You should make changes so that they will ask, ma nishtana, and then you start telling the story. What's the sequence there? What's going on there? Can someone speak that out for us in plain language? Why make changes?
It seems like Maimonides is encouraging parents to create an emotional truth for their children, not just like a pedagogical truth of the Passover.
That's interesting. Why do you use the language of emotion? Explain what you mean. Like, what's the emotional experience happening?
So I don't know what background everyone on the call has, but for me, like, I have very nostalgic moments about my childhood seders and what they looked like. And I think the way that children perceive the world is so centered around like their experiences, and changing those around can create real intense memories for them.
Okay, good. Okay, so part of what you're talking about is the sort of the sensory, the experiential, and those sort of like those sensory experiences, they get embedded in what you're calling like nostalgia, which is a kind of an emotional holding place or reservoir. I have had these, I have these memories and I associate with them certain kinds of feelings. Okay, very nice. Other people? Liz?
Just the way on Rosh Hashanah we blow the shofar as a wake-up call, just changing things around in a significant way is also a wake-up call, and it makes you pay attention in a, not just more, but in a different way.
Okay, good. That's definitely happening here. We are waking them up, right? It's a good comparison to Rosh Hashanah, Liz. We do this thing, we snatch the table away, and then all of a sudden they're alert. And then what? They're alert, and then, well, like there's an intention here. What are we trying to, yeah, Dana.
Then you can pay attention. Then they see it's different than every other normal night, every other Shabbat. It makes it stand out more.
Good. All of this is true. All of this is true. But there's one more thing. They pay attention, they're engaged, they're alert, and?
They feel like slaves.
What do they do? What does Maimonides, let's take a look again. What does Maimonides say that they do? You do all these crazy things, you make changes on this night so the children will see and?
Ask questions.
That's right. The point is you're trying to get this is classic language. Manishtana halayla azeh. Like the Magid section begins with that. The telling section begins. In other words, we are trying to create a situation in which children will not just be focused or engaged and entertained, but actually where their curiosity is sparked to the point that they will say, wait, what's going on here? And it's a little bit of like, there's something that feels a little kind of like phony about it. Like you do something weird and they're like, what's happening here? And then, oh, well, you want to know what's happening? I'll tell you, it's the story of Egypt. But there is stuff like that in the Seder. Like we wash our hands twice during the Seder. There's no real reason for that except we're doing unusual things. So there is this principle that we just want to get a child to the point where she says, wait, what's happening here? I don't understand what's happening. And that's good. And then we can begin telling the story of Egypt. So the question is, why is that good? Why do we want her saying, hold on, I've got a question. Why is that important so important that it's embedded in law in the experience?
You want them to feel involved in what's happening in the story?
Good, thanks, Sophia. So involved in what way? What do you mean involved?
So like you want them to also be a participant in telling the story so that like they can continue to tell the story also. And also like feel connected to the characters and their ancestors.
Okay, wonderful. Anyone else want to add to that?
I feel like there's also a sense of, by doing these kind of crazy things that have shock value and turning their world upside down a little bit, I think you're also enabling yourself to step outside your usual parental role of where everything is always lined up and you have to do things in a certain way. And it's almost like you're vicariously living through your children. It's like, whoa, they're shocked, and well, I'm the one causing the shock, so I'm kind of cool. And I think it gets everybody on the same page of, reliving. You're supposed to, act as if you came out of Egypt. So you too are going to be immersed in it in the same way, that I think if you're sort of going along for the ride with them.
Okay, wonderful. I love that. I hear in both of these comments a sense that we want the children, the listeners, to be active participants in the Seder and engaged, not just to the point of paying attention, but so that they are also telling the story. They are also helping the story be told. And Sophia was even alluding to one day they'll be the tellers of the story. Like they have to be fully engaged to the point of participating. And in order to gauge that that's happened, we have to get to the point where they have a question. And as soon as they're saying, wait, what's going on here? That's enough. I mean, we list different kinds of questions, like maybe the wise child says, oh, I notice all these things are different, and the simpler child is just like, huh? But a lot of us are simple children. Like a lot of us don't know what the heck is going on. And that's this principle, like the last one, we can expand beyond just children into a general principle of the Magid, which is that it should be a conversation. like there should be questions and answers and different opinions and different kinds of storytelling. Like, I hope you're beginning to get the sense that it really isn't just someone telling the story and everybody else listening. It isn't just someone reading the book and everybody else waiting for their turn. The idea of Magid truly lived out, as the rabbis imagined it, is that there's a dialogue, and the story could be told in multiple ways, but it has to be a conversation. Okay, so those are a couple things. Yeah.
Sorry to interrupt.
No, interrupting's good.
I was gonna ask, is there something to like in Exodus, in the story of Passover, like seeing the Israelites as like children from like a spiritual perspective, and that's like this is a part of how we actually live that. That we see ourselves as if we're coming out of Egypt. We have to actually put ourselves in that level of curiosity and confusion and like bewilderment that the Israelites themselves were experiencing. I've never really thought about it like this, but that we sort of have to take ourselves through that journey of confusion and see ourselves as children in a not only an age.
Oh, I love that. I love that. And I think Rabbi Tzadok is going to pick up on this more later, but there is some general principle that we have to identify even thousands of years later with having left Egypt. How do we do that? So it's the same, like what we're trying to accomplish is what we're trying to, I love the connection you just made. And in Caroline's box, I see a hand raised.
So, hi, I'm Jonathan. So to follow up on that, actually going back to something that I was going to try to talk about earlier when you talked about the similar language between remembering Passover and remembering Shabbat, which is that we actually get the commandment to observe Shabbat right after the Exodus, essentially. I mean, but you know, at Sinai, it's kind of, and to what Joanna was saying, it's almost sort of like we were too immature and unformed to have it prior to that, and like the entire process of the Exodus is the process of our sort of coming into our own and really like becoming a people and sort of gaining a kind of a kind of religious identity and maturity and we had to do it twice because the first time we got so impatient that we built a calf, but nevertheless, like building up to the point where the commandment to observe Shabbat could even mean something and be respected adequately from us. So it's sort of the process of our maturation at that point.
Okay, I love this. I love this line of thought and interpretation, what Joanna and Jonathan have offered us. And I want to just point out that, first of all, this is why I like learning these things together, because it takes it to new places I haven't thought of. But I just want to point out that this is kind of like meta. Like what we're doing right now is exactly what's supposed to happen on Passover night. Like I'm supposed to be leading the Seder, but then you say something that I haven't thought of before, and I think, oh, that is kind of what's happening here. And together, we begin to figure out deeper levels of the story of Egypt. That's exactly the purpose of all this. Okay, let me just do one more thing. We're soon going to break up into our little groups, but I want to, before we do, share one more piece of Maimonides all together, because we've been talking about children, the telling of the story to children, that being the central act of the Haggadah, and then thinking about, well, you know, are there lessons here that apply to all of us, whether we have children or not? But actually, Maimonides addresses that case very specifically. He already said, oh, you tell the story even if you don't have children. But look at what he says at the end. And by the way, I'm someone who's going to be celebrating Passover just here alone in my house this year, right? So this is for those of us who are like in just like twos or ones or, you know, no children around. Take a look at this one. When a person does not have a child, his spouse should ask him, "Manishtana balayla hazeh." Like then his spouse should say, "Okay, I'll play. Why is this night different than all other nights?" And if one doesn't have a spouse, then two people should ask each other. Two friends should get together and be like, why is this night different? Well, I'll tell you. Why is this night different? Like we reenact that same getting people to ask questions. And then look at this. This is my situation. And even if a person is all alone, he should ask himself, Manishtana, why is it? Like I'm going to do that this year. I'm going to say, David, why is this night different than all other nights? Well, David, that's an interesting question. So like this is in our legal code. So like this is let's just end here. Why would we do that silly thing? Why am I going to do that silly thing? What is the purpose of getting into that mode of question, of even to the point where you ask yourself the question? Can anyone sort of speak out the value that Maimonides is articulating here?
What? Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Oh, hi.
Hi. Are you Ethan Harris Riggs?
Ethan, there's Ethan Harris.
There's Ethan. Hi, Ethan.
It was so interesting to hear you say the sort of the origin between mentioning and remembering. And, you know, I think by creating an event or an experience is in fact what makes us remember something, rather than it just going in one ear and then out the other. If you're jarred into the moment and experiencing it, then you will remember it, and then you will mention it.
Yeah.
Which is what we're asked to do.
Great. So all of the things we've been saying about children is true for us as well. We should be active learners, participants. We should have associations, emotional resonance, all of these things.
And when you ask yourself that by yourself, when you're asking yourself questions, you're going to remember that.
Right.
You're going to create something to mention. You won't forget, right?
Yeah. Liz, we'll take a couple more thoughts and then we're going to go into our breakout groups. Liz?
Well, I think what's really interesting, and I was not aware of the commandment to do it by yourself, but I think what that does is it reinforces that we are all part of the Jewish people. We are all part of the community, and it doesn't allow somebody to stand outside of it, but requires that even if we're alone, we raise our hand and be counted. It's really interesting. I never heard that before.
Yeah. Anyone got a last thought before we break?
There's also something about like renewing of the vows. Like it's been a year since you told the story maybe, and so you're just sort of, you know, what does this mean to me? It's just good to reflect in a different way. And even if you're by yourself, like how, you know, I'm going to take stock. What do I think about this whole coming out of Egypt? What is this narrow strait that I'm coming out of?
Yeah, we're about to break into groups. You know, we're going to break into groups with people who have kids and people who have little kids. So there's a way in which, yes, there are different kinds of Passover experiences and performances and storytellings given the different setting that you're in. But on some level, we've started all together because on some level, the core mitzvah of Passover, of telling this to your children, is actually, it's relevant for us all. There's something about that process of learning how to pass on this story that is important for everybody, and everybody has to be both the parent and the child, and even sometimes both to once, you know, both at once, right? Like there's something about that dynamic of passing that story on and getting someone else and getting yourself engaged that's critical to the Maggid experience. So if you've got nothing else from this as you head into your breakout group, just know you don't have to just read the text of the Maggid. The telling of the story is something that is meant to be just as we think of it, a real telling of a story. Okay, so with that said, let's go into our breakout groups. This is going to be just 1 minute of messiness because in order to get them, we need to know who. Rabbi Tzadok, you want to pop on?
Yeah, I'm just going to interrupt really quick. We are going to just do one breakout group for anybody who wants to talk about engaging kids of any age. Beth, Jane, and I will take the conversation together. So just simplified it quite a bit. So you'll just raise a hand, either virtually or with your actual hand,
cool.
and let us know.
Raise your hand, and we have Andrea, I think, on the call, and she's keeping track. Okay, Caroline has a hand raised. Joanna's got a hand raised. You can, I see Liana's got a hand raised. Ethan Harris Riggs got a hand raised. Anyone else?
Leanna.
Leanna's got a hand raised, great.
Leanna.
Anyone else?
Sorry, what are we raising hands for?
To go to the special tips for Seder for kids.
The little ones or elementary?
We're doing all kids in one breakout group. Okay, Mariana.
All right, so I've got Caroline, Joanna, Ethan Harris Riggs, Leanna, and Mariana. Is there anyone I missed?
Anyone else?
Kelly, who's the 917.
Kelly, you want to go into the, okay, great. Beautiful. So I'm going to go ahead and push that group along with Rabbi Sadok and Beth and Jane.
The rest of you stay with me. We will continue to learn a little bit together.
All right, guys, just bear with me for just 1 minute while I get that group set apart. Rabbi Kasher, feel free to keep talking, but I am going to go ahead and get that group selected and sent over, okay?
Okay, I guess I will. I'll keep talking. I mean, gosh, that's the only thing I know how to do, right? So I'll do it. Here we go. So what we're going to do now together, we've looked at some of the basics. What is the general idea of Magid? But that still leaves us with like an elephant in the room, which is the Haggadah itself, right? The Haggadah itself, which is so weird and so like not a great way of telling the story. Actually, when we open the Haggadah, I think most of our experience is like, wait, what story exactly is being told here? Like this doesn't make any sense. So what I want to do now that we've understood a little bit what Magid is supposed to be, is to dive into the Haggadah itself, into the Magid section of the Haggadah, and try to figure out like what's going on there. Okay, and the Magid section begins with a couple of like bold declarations. Halach ma'anya, this is the bread of affliction. Let all who are hungry come and eat. And some big and bold kind of like declarations of like we are about to tell the story and God saved us and ta-da. And then the first real kind of section that we get is a very odd little moment. Let's take a look at it together. Those of us who are in the older demographic or the childless demographic, so we could be older or younger. Okay, from the Haggadah, the Magid section. All right, it happened, maseh, and the word maseh actually means a story. Okay, so it happened. There's a story about Rabbi Eliezer, Rabbi Yehoshua, Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, Rabbi Akiva, and Rabbi Tarfon, and they were reclining at a Seder, presumably, in Bnei Brak, which is a city near Tel Aviv. They were discussing the Exodus from Egypt all that night until their students came and told them, "Our masters, the time has come for reciting the morning Shema." Okay, so on its face is the story about how they got so distracted with the telling of the story that they almost forgot to say Shema the next. Like, what is this doing here? What is the point of this? Why is this in our Haggadah? Doesn't tell the story of Egypt at all. Why is it in our Haggadah? There is no official answer, so you are invited to speculate. What's going on here?
Well, you were just talking about the importance of like the meta Haggadah, right? The like talking about the Exodus. Seems like this is kind of a picture of like what that looks like.
Okay, bing, bing, bing. Like I think that's exactly right, and that's, you know, I don't have a whole lot more wisdom to share here, but I do think that's where my mind is heading, where Yonatan's is, which is that what is this have to do with Passover at all, except that it is an example, an instance, kind of a story about telling the story of Egypt, right? It's not about the story of Egypt. It's about people trying to tell the story of Egypt. And I think that it is, what Yonatan has latched on to here is exactly the clue that we need to understand the Haggadah. I think this story it's kind of obvious. It's just like a story about people telling stories. But I think as we begin to move through the rest of the Haggadah, that's exactly what we're going to see. And once we keep this principle in mind, the Haggadah will begin to make a lot more sense, which is that the Haggadah, the Magid section of the Haggadah, is not really the story of the Exodus from Egypt. That's the book of Exodus. This is really a collection of attempts to tell the story of Egypt. This is like a catalog or kind of greatest hits of people trying to tell the story of Egypt. That little story of those 4 rabbis sitting around telling the story, that's one Passover, that's one Magid. But there are many storytelling episodes recorded in the Haggadah. The most famous one we've already referred to, which is the next section of the Haggadah, that the Torah speaks of 4 children, Keneged Arba Banim Dibrat Torah. And I'm not going to read the whole thing, but you know, this is the most famous part, so you know how it goes. One is wise, one is wicked, one is simple, one doesn't know how to ask. And you have here different ways of telling the story based on the different questions that you get, the different children that are in front of you. Now, I'm not going to belabor this point because we've already made it, but it fits again into this, what I'm offering as a kind of a framework for thinking about what is the Haggadah, which is that the Haggadah is a collection of kind of storytelling tips and anecdotes and records of how people tried to tell the story of Egypt. So I offer that to you because it was very useful to me, because once I started to think about the Haggadah in this way, then parts of the Haggadah that had historically just bored me to tears at least started to make a little sense. And this, what I'm about to show you, is my least favorite section of the Haggadah, the part that I just like, when we get to every year, I'm like, why are we reading this? Okay, so here we go. Rabbi Yossi HaGlili says, from where can you derive that the Egyptians were struck with 10 plagues in Egypt and struck with 50 plagues at the sea? In Egypt, what does it state? Then the magician said unto Pharaoh, this is the finger of God. And at the sea, what does it state? And Israel saw the Lord's great hand that he used upon the Egyptian. And the people feared the Lord. Finger, hand, right? And they believed in the Lord and Moshe his servant. How many times were they struck? How many were they struck with the finger? 10 plagues. So that means that at the sea, they were struck with 50 plagues. Like, okay, but then it continues. Rabbi Eliezer says, from where can you derive that every plague that the Holy Blessed One brought upon the Egyptians in Egypt was itself composed of 4 plagues? And I'm not going to go through all of this, but it's a similar kind of dialogue. And Rabbi Akiva keeps going, from where can you derive that every plague the Holy Blessed One brought upon the Egyptians in Egypt was composed of 5 plagues? Now, like, in the midst of the Haggadah itself, you're just sitting, or at least I'm sitting there like, what is going on here? But if we bring this principle of framing the Haggadah as a series of storytelling episodes or storytelling approaches, then let's think for a minute, what kind of storytelling is this? What are these rabbis up to? How are they telling the story of Egypt?
Kind of through like facts and details to some extent.
Good,
like,
yeah.
Yeah.
You want to continue, Corinne?
Yeah, no, it was interesting as you were talking before. It almost felt like the symbolism of echoes came to mind, where it's like every time you tell the story, someone else hears this different echo of it, but that echo can become your reality. And so for some people, like the fact and the detail is what makes the story, and for others it's the morals, and for others it's something else. And so it's kind of like different hooks into ways of remembering.
Yeah, nice.
I mean, for me, can you hear me? So
Yeah,
for me, the Haggadah, it's almost an anthology, because the Exodus is the first Exodus, but it's not the last time that befell the Jews. So you have to follow the first temple, to follow the second temple. So it's a continuation in telling, like, okay, we had plagues, but other plagues kept on falling upon us. And so if you look at like the historical, like when it's written, I think stuff kept on getting added to it based on where in the Exodus of the Jewish people they were, whether they were living in Jerusalem or they were part of the diaspora. So they kept on adding to it to tell their current story of them in the diaspora.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's interesting. And we can see here a kind of like, we're adding things to the story. There's an embellishing even. Like you see, like, this is almost like tall tales. Like, there were 10 plagues. You know what? I can prove there were 50. There were 200. There were 250. Like, it's just like, this is also a mode of storytelling of like, of counting things, of like statistics, but also just sort of like exaggerated ways of, and their means of doing that was through what they call midrash, like making connections in the text. But they're like using all these little details and connections in order to say the story was grander and grander and grander than you ever thought, okay? So what we have here is maybe not my favorite part of the Haggadah, but another example of rabbis figuring out ways to tell this story, and whether they're adding to it or whether they're embellishing it or whether they're providing us like deeper insight into it. Here you can see them competing to outdo one another on how grand their story is. Okay, so one last example I just want to give you, and in some ways this is the most basic of another, and it's the final one in the Magid section. Another example of how do you tell this story. And Rabban Gamliel has a very simple formula. He says, Rabban Gamliel Haya Omer, he says, anyone who hasn't said these three things on Pesach, on Passover, has not fulfilled his obligation. And these are them. The Pesach Matzah Umaror. The Pesach Sacrifice, the Matzah and Maror. In other words, Rabban Gamliel is saying, look, when it comes right down to it, if you want to make sure you tell the story well, you've got to make sure to say it, to make mention of three things. Explain why we give a Passover sacrifice, a Paschal lamb. Explain why we eat matzah, and explain why we eat maror. Okay, that's his most kind of condensed. Like, here is the essence, the core of how you tell the story is you explain these three items. Now, I don't know, anyone have a sense of what he's thinking, why he boils it down to those sort of three basics?
Are we allowed to parrot Rabbi Brous from this afternoon?
You certainly are, yeah. I'm fond of quoting her. Good, well, give us a sense a little bit of where Rabbi Brous was going with all this. You don't remember, I do.
Oh, see, now I have to remember. Yeah, I remember Maror and why it comes
good, that's good, that's enough. Why would it be important to mention Maror?
The symbolism of choosing to embitter our own lives for the sake of empathy with our ancestors.
Good. Maror represents the bitterness of the life that our ancestors led in Egypt. So we eat it, and through eating it, we remember that. But Rabban Gamliel is saying, yeah, you should explain that. So people aren't eating gross stuff. They should know that part of what they're doing is they're trying to connect to that experience. And Rabbi Brous said, so too the matzah has a particular meaning. It's about being ready, being like getting yourself into the spirit of being ready to leave Egypt. And so too the Paschal lamb has a particular, that's Passover. Like, you have to explain what was Passover, what happened, what was the significance of that experience. So anyone want to add to that before we move forward with it? But I think that's exactly right. Rabban Gamliel is saying, as Yonatan suggests, that each of these things represents some key feature of what the story is. And, it's hard to tell the whole story, but if you can just get people into the sense of like, why are we doing these things? What was our life like then? What was that moment of leaving? What was the straw that broke the camel's back? Like, what are the main things that we need to know? And Maimonides speaks this out for us again. I'm going to return now to Maimonides, who I told you, everything that you find in like earlier sources, Maimonides has summarized. So we're back to Maimonides here, and he just repeats, anyone who does not say these three things during the night of the 15th has not fulfilled his obligation, Pesach, Matzah, and Maror, and he explains them. The Passover offering because God passed over the houses of our ancestors, and Maror because the Egyptians embittered the lives of our ancestors in Egypt, and Matzah because we were redeemed. But look at how he ends this, and this is really like gets to the point of our whole discussion. He says, "V'dvarim elu kulan," these things, these three items, explaining these three items, hen hanikrain Haggadah. That's called Haggadah. Now, that's like what he's done there is said something that for our purposes, I think is really important to keep in mind, to understand, which is that we read from the Haggadah. We like recite the Haggadah. But Maimonides says, if we want to know what is Haggadah, what does it mean to tell the story of Egypt? Well, Rabban Gamliel's giving you the most boiled down version. You just explain these 3 things and that's Haggadah. Or if you prefer the come up with how many plagues were at the sea in 250, well, that's also Haggadah. Or if you've got 4 different kids in front of you and they all need to hear the story in a different way, you tell the story 4 different ways, and that's Haggadah, right? Or maybe it's just 4 of you sitting around discussing cool ideas and insights into the story of the Exodus all night, and you get wrapped up, and that's Haggadah, right? Or maybe it's just you saying, hey, David, ma nishtana, and oh, well, I'll tell you, halayla hazeh kulanu misubim, and that's Haggadah. Like whatever. In other words, I hope we've come to understand what Magid is and where it comes from and how it works. But I also hope we've come to understand that it's, though it is a commandment, it's an obligation, it's the central part of the Passover story, and it applies to us all, whether we have children or not, whether we're alone or not even. Nevertheless, there are an infinite number of ways to perform this commandment. There are an infinite number of ways to tell the story of Egypt. And so I hope that we not only understand it a little better what we're up to on Passover night, but that like every box in this sort of Hollywood squares is going to have a different Haggadah. That we're not all going to read the same Haggadah. Maybe we'll, refer to it, but everybody's got their own Haggadah. Everybody's got their own way of telling the story, and that's the way it's supposed to be. That's the way it was designed. And if we get too, you can see I'm anxious about this because I feel like we've gotten too lost in the just sort of like you read next, and that's nice as far as it goes, but it isn't that sort of back and forth dialogue. This, the million ways of telling the story of Exodus. That's the commandment of Magid that we're supposed to be carrying out on Passover. Okay. Any final thoughts? Anybody? Any final questions? Any final confusions? Yeah, Kareem.
As you're talking, I guess, and I'm sorry because I missed the beginning, so I don't know if you speak to this at all, but it feels like the way that we're talking about like the Haggadah can also be a microcosm of like the Torah. And so is there something about like the Passover rituals of storytelling, and like we relearn the same things all the time, and like our rituals of doing the same thing every week, reading the Torah again and again? Is there something specific about the Haggadah that we're supposed to abstract in a bigger way?
Yeah, that question is better than any answer I could give on the spot. But it's a provocative question. You suggest that maybe this whole religion should be a little more individualized, and maybe a lot of our rituals could be formulated to fit the moment. Now, I think there is a deep value in our tradition for like the exact words of the Torah, or the exact way to perform the commandment. And some commandments are more exacting and some less, but it's a really good question. Like if the message of the Haggadah is there are a million ways to tell this story, then one begins to wonder, like, aren't there a million ways of doing a lot of our Jewish lives? Yeah, more. I think there's more to say there, and I will not venture to offer an unformulated opinion.
That's helpful. Thank you.
Can you go over a little bit about what we do after dinner and why?
What's that?
Can you go over the part that's after the dinner and why we do that? Because that's technically the longer part.
Great. I will not do that right now on this call. We're at 8:30 and it's great to end on time. I'm happy to do that with you, Payam, but I'm going to use that question to again let you all know that we're going to have a little bit longer session on Sunday from 2 to 4, where I really go through. We just did Magid tonight. Right, that's just one of 15 steps of the Seder. On Sunday, we're going to go through every one of the pieces of the order, the Seder, and just sort of explain how it all works, including the Nirtzah, the end of the Seder, and the heading into all of these songs, which in some ways are like not officially part of the Seder, but we'll describe the entire Passover night on Sunday. Hopefully, all your questions will be answered then. Anything else? Any other queries or thoughts? Great. I think we got a lot done in this hour. and I certainly learned from you all, and that's, as I said, is sort of that's the point of all of our learning, but certainly should be the way we feel on Passover. We should all be we should also all be zoche. We should merit to hear the story in a different way this year, and to tell the story in a different way this year. Love you all. Good to see you. Nice learning with you. Let's see. Tomorrow, I'll actually be teaching a class at noon. I'm subbing for Rabbi Tzadok. And then we have the Chavruta project, studying Pirkei Avot tomorrow at 6. There are Shiva gatherings on our calendar for people who have lost people during this time, which is a strange thing to have to do. And we started to do pre-Shabbat, Kabbalat Shabbat. So you'll see that on Friday as well. So stay connected, stay healthy, stay happy, and we'll see you again on the screen soon. All right. Bye, everyone.